Hi, everyone. My name is Suken. I'm a managing partner at Iterative. Iterative is a YC style accelerator focused exclusively on Southeast Asia. Today, we have Jeffrey Liu and Justin Louie from Gen Phi. Thank you both for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Do you guys want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Jeff. I'm one of the co-founders of Gen Phi, also the CEO of the company. We basically got together middle of last year and started putting this company together.
I'm Justin, CTO of Gen Phi. To Jeff's detriment, I actually been with him for plus additional 4 years with Guava Pass. So doing the second time around for thing.
We should talk about that towards the I have some questions here, but we should talk about that towards the other part too of just like working with the same people over again, because Brian and I work together so often, and like I feel like relationships change a little bit, but we'll get into that. Okay, so the first part is I just want to hear the story about kind of like how you guys got into startups. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with this podcast is to humanize founders, and kind of bridge the gap between like we were all kind of like working jobs and kind of had gone to school like everybody else. And then at some point we kind of made the decision. So, but before we kind of tackle a lot of that, can you guys talk a little bit kind of like where you grew up and your circumstances around that?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start first. My life has been pretty nomadic. So I grew up in 5 countries as a kid. My parents were expats. So ended up living in actually many parts of Asia. So lived in Hong Kong, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore, and then also different parts of the US. So it was a really fun sort of childhood in the sense that I got to experience a lot of new cultures and environments, interact with friends that were just from all over the world, and basically getting around countries where I couldn't even speak the language. So I think one of that kind of created that trait of me of being able to adapt to very strange foreign environments, and it's kind of been with me ever since the beginning. So my dad worked for Citibank,
What did your parents do that made you had you kind of
and
move around
back
so much?
back in the 70s and 80s, it was a very fast growing region for that for the bank in Asia.
Oh, so he was kind of opening up in different countries and that kind of stuff.
Basically, yeah.
Okay, Justin.
So I'm born and raised in Seattle, which is actually how I know Brian and Suken. We go way back to school and even church. And so did the startup scene out in Seattle for a little while in the real estate 08, 09. That was kind of probably the toughest time to be doing a real estate startup if you're familiar with the whole crash back in 08, 09. But then ended up moving out to Hong Kong because I don't know Chinese. I'm supposed to, but I don't. And wanted to learn Chinese. Instead, the whole shindig is I got married instead. And during that time, while I was doing a little bit of home automation startup work in Hong Kong, I got in touch with Jeff. That was back in 2015.
Did you and so I guess for the audience, like Brian is my partner on almost all the startups and at Iterative. And Justin and I went to college together. But Justin, you knew
Mm-hmm.
Brian
Yeah,
before
so
college?
I went to church with them back in Seattle, and so yeah, that whole crew that you guys all run together with, I know all of you.
You're one of the rare people that has known Brian longer
Yeah,
than I
right.
have known Brian.
Weird claim. Mino Pizzo, I think if that's a name that can come up.
Yeah, I mean, yes, yes. And how did you guys? And you kind of Justin, you touched on it a little bit. Like, how did you guys end up meeting? You guys met in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So this is pretty interesting. So this is back in late 2014. I had just finished my stint at Beachmint, and so I was moving back out to Singapore, where my parents were based. And I always had the itch to come back to Asia, just after spending so many years in the U.S. Just from everything that was happening out here. And at that time, I was going through the drawing board of just all these different startup ideas, and one of my biggest problems was that I'm not technical, and so in order for me to get any of these ideas actually working, I needed a technical co-founder. And so I looked around in Singapore. To my disappointment, there was like literally nobody in Singapore at that time that I could find that was sort of on the same wavelength as me. And so then I asked a very old friend of mine who happened to know a tech person, and it turned out to be Justin. And so we were introduced over Skype. I guess at that time, Justin was actually interviewing me in terms of kind of what my projects were. And I threw like, plenty of ideas at him, of which every single one of them was vetoed by him. And so I felt pretty disappointed. But then eventually, by the time we got to Guava Pass, that was the one of the last ideas that he finally felt very convinced was going to take off. And so that's how we actually ended up meeting.
Oh no, I was just gonna say like, I feel like your thing about like, hey, needing to find a technical co-founder in order to get any of these ideas off is probably like it's like a problem that is very common in Southeast Asia. How were you trying to find a technical co-founder before Justin? Were you like, I mean, emailing lots of friends? You were just like randomly adding people on LinkedIn? Like, what was the strategy?
Yeah, I mean, I did the whole shebang in terms of, all the advice is like, you got to go like networking, go to like all these different startup events and mixers. And so, for the first like 2 months, I was attending every single startup event that was organized in Singapore, and I just couldn't find anything. Then I started asking around, and then everybody just says, just ask your network. And then I'm like, okay, I've already basically asked everybody I know, and I still can't find anybody. And then I even considered just like outsourcing the whole project. I started talking to these development shops in Vietnam, but I just realized it just didn't seem like the right way to get started. And so, I just got really lucky when I got introduced to Justin.
And when you were going to the events, what was not working? Were you just like, there's no engineers here actually? It's like everybody else is just kind of like me, or is it like I don't it doesn't seem like a culture fit to the people here.
So I mean, there's definitely engineers, but I feel like a lot of the engineers, they just don't have the chemistry that I was looking for, and I think that's a really big part when you're finding a co-founder, and that's actually the most important element to consider. And I just didn't really feel like I hit it off. I didn't know it was. I thought the problem might have been myself, right? Maybe I was just like, coming from the U.S., maybe the mentality was too different, but it was just every time I got in those conversations during those mixers, just we didn't really seem to have much to talk about or sort of the same kind of ideas that were aligned and passion. And so I just didn't really feel like there was a good fit there.
Yeah, fit's so important, right? I mean, I think it's like being a good engineer is like kind of like table stakes, but like the fit is kind of such an important part. Justin, what was it like for you on the flip side? Because oftentimes engineers like have the opposite problem where it's like everybody's trying to pitch them their business idea. So I'm sure Jeff wasn't the first person to come talk to you about ideas. So, how did you kind of make a decision on who to actually kind of work with?
I think that question becomes a lot more real when we talk about the transition between GuavaPass to Gen Phi. We can say that for a little bit, but overall, the general problem as an engineer is, yeah, it seems like everything can be built. At the same time, you'll only want to build things that are realistically worth building. And so, how do you make that decision? And parts of me are like that just comes with time because everything potentially can seem interesting. But once you've seen a few business models and worked with a couple of them, then you realize, okay, I have to pick and choose a few things that look like they have legs. And I think you can't necessarily go all in or have expectations that this will go to the moon. I think you build it one step at a time once you've made that decision. But really, it is talking to the people and having that chemistry and and kind of being able to, as a technical co-founder, you're not as technical as many would hope you to believe to be. I think you need to be able to bridge many gaps from product to leading to be able to also executing at a certain level such that you can carry it to a certain point, and then you get some help to be able to keep moving forward. But that very first step, that early stage, it is scary and it's difficult. And I wish there was an easy blueprint to say, oh yeah, this is the money you should put your time behind. But no, it's not. It's not like that.
What about Jeff? Where you kind of like made you want to work with him? Was there anything that stood out about him when you first kind of like talked to him on the Skype call?
I, I think it's just the way that he asked questions back to me. I think, and the way that he qualified.
I told him no a bunch of times, so I became
Yes,
the hot
I
chick.
think. I mean, that's part
Is
of
that
it.
something
But
I can say? I became really attractive.
I think the important thing actually, and actually as a partner too, is just the ability to challenge and constructively criticize and to not constantly just kind of say yes, right? So I guess that was the problem I had with a lot of the early conversations I had with other engineering type candidates was they were just all they wanted to understand was what am I trying to build, and then they're just going to build it without even really thinking through about the business side of things and kind of what are we actually, what is the bigger vision and what are we trying to build together. So that was not the right kind of relationship that I was looking for, and I felt like with Justin it was very felt like it was like talking to someone that was almost like a friend already after the first conversation, and really understood kind of the type of thing that we're trying to build.
Yeah, I think that's a difference between a technical co-founder maybe and like an engineer at the company. Like if you're looking for a technical co-founder, it's like you are looking for somebody who isn't just concerned with like building it, right? Like they want to kind of dig into the business a little bit more, and it's like a technical skill but in service of the business. Whereas I feel like maybe an engineer at a company is maybe just like primarily concerned with kind of building it. I think the best ones are broader than that, but I think that distinction is really important in like in a co-founder. Justin, do you feel like that is something that is true in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you can't challenge the business, and you have to, because if only one person's like effectively building the business, it's going to go in a direction that's not feasible. One, technically, and then two, I iron sharpens iron, steel sharpens steel, right? And I believe very much that co-founders need to be able to gel in that particular fashion, which is part of one of the reasons why I moved from Hong Kong to Singapore, was to be able to be near Jeff and Rob at the time.
I see. And how did you guys kind of like, so Justin, I know you were doing some startup stuff in Seattle, so like Guava Pass wasn't necessarily your first one, right? But Jeff, it was your first one. So you had to make this call to kind of like be a founder, which I think, whenever we talk to a lot of, we've been calling them future founders or potential founders, there's always this kind of like chasm that they got to jump, right? Where it's like, do I quit my job? Is this the idea? Like, how did you like think through some of those questions for yourself?
Yeah, so I would say that entrepreneurial journey actually started for Guava Pass. So what happened was, this was back when I was in the U.S. I was just in the midst of business school. My whole career was basically finance at that time, and there was just this one random day when I had a old friend of mine who was from LA, who told me to just meet up with him. And it was the middle of winter in Chicago, so obviously it was very nice to go to the warm, sunny LA. And so I booked that flight. And little did I know, within like 20 minutes of arriving LA, I was whisked away to his office, and he told me he was a co-founder of a women's fashion e-commerce company, to his partner at that time, who happened to be the founder of MySpace. So it was all very, very sort of surreal for me. And sort of within 30 minutes of that conversation, the MySpace founder said, "Hey, why don't you work for me? I'm about to really, take this business to the next level." And, I never really considered startups or anything in that space prior to that conversation. But then it was just that raw energy that kind of just got me to sort of just dive head into the startup world. And then next thing I knew, by the time I was moving to LA, every single person that I was encountering, I guess it's not as robust as SF, but in LA, it was still quite interesting in terms of just the number of entrepreneurs and founders. And it's just surrounded by all these people who were all just so different in sort of their mindset and mentality from anything that I've been used to before. The fact that it's normal to take risk, right, is something that was weird for me at that time. But then eventually, after a few years, it just became like, the norm for me as well. And so I think just diving headfirst into that SoCal ecosystem in the startup world really just changed my perspective very quickly.
It's funny how being in these places will like normalize some of this risk taking, right? If you're just around people who all are kind of doing a similar thing, the risk doesn't seem as great because everybody around you is doing it. It just seems like normal. Justin, what was it like for you? Maybe back into the Seattle part when you were kind of like doing it. I mean, I knew you back then. I think there was a lot of us thinking about it. What was your kind of personal interaction with it?
Man, we kind of started off at the same time, right? Because you did it just after college. I did it maybe a year and a half. I think it's just easy to say I was young and dumb at the time, but the allure of startups and the ability to build something, I was just like, let's just do this. It took a couple of years for me to gain the experience to be able to be discerning and go, okay, like you got to do these things. These things matter, and it's still a thing that we're honing even to this day. Like we don't have everything made, and I think and any good founder should tell you that it's all, you're just trying to figure it out every single day.
I feel like being dumb and naive, as you were kind of putting it, is like underrated because I feel like a lot of us got started. We just didn't know how hard startups were, and so we just kind of got started. Jeff, it sounds like for you, you were maybe not as you were. When did you kind of? What was that? 4 years ago? How old were you?
I just turned 30 when I started GuavaPass.
Okay, so yeah, I think I see
So
this.
not as young as I should have been.
Well, no, I don't think it's that. I think it's like I see this in some of my friends who are entrepreneurs. There's like a group of people who started when they were like 21, 22, and they, more or less, we all got started because we were dumb and naive, and so just didn't know any better, and so got into it. And it actually, I think, is harder to start when you're in your 30s because you know so much more, and so you're kind of more discerning about stuff. And yeah, I think it's a different calculation when you if you're starting when you're 30. Like, what were some of the things that?
There's momentum in your system. I would say, like, you have a job, you have a certain payload to go from that to basically nothing. That's
The stakes are a lot higher for you as you go further along in life, right? Just obviously just from the opportunity costs and everything. And so that's why it's really hard when I actually talk to my peers now, and because we're all in the same age group, it gets even harder for them now to even think about doing anything entrepreneur versus 6 years ago.
How do you think you overcame that when you were? I mean, you started when you were 30, right? And so, I mean, your opportunity cost is huge. But I started when I was like 21, and I had like no opportunity cost, like it was nothing. So
Yeah, so I think maybe this is advice for the audience as well. Is you basically give yourself a time limit in terms of like a do or die moment where you either have to do it within a certain time or you don't do it. And so I decided to take the plunge because I gave myself a full 6 months at that time. I was in sort of in transition, and so we had just completed a merger for Beachmint, and so I was able to move on. And so I wanted to get something off the ground within 6 months from sort of leaving Beachmint at that time. And I guess what really helped was having a co-founder. So at that time, my co-founder was this gentleman Rob, who was very very idealistic, but also very encouraging in the sense that we would push each other, and so I would feel accountable to him as well, and I felt like I couldn't let him down, with getting something off the ground, and so that kind of self reinforces, and I think that's a really probably a very important advice for first time founders is you're probably better off finding a co-founder because that type of sort of someone to kind of bounce ideas off with and to kind of criticize what you're doing and giving each other sort of peer pressure actually really helps with moving forward, which is the hardest step, right? When you're trying to get something off the ground.
yeah, you build this like accountability, like feedback loop, right? Where you say you're going to tell the other person you're going to do stuff, and then you don't want to let them down, and then it kind of goes vice versa. And yeah, it helps kind of a lot in the beginning. So how did you guys, moving on a little bit, how did you guys like decide Guava Pass? Jeff, it sounds like you had like a whole list of ideas, right? Justin, you vetoed most of them, and then you got to this point where you're like, hey, I've got this idea. It wasn't called Guava Pass at first, I'm sure. What was the original? Did you guys have some weird name?
It was actually the first name that we came up with.
Oh, it was. Wow.
Part of it was this elaborate story of how my co-founder saw a guava fruit in a healthy vegetarian restaurant and didn't know what a guava was. But the real reason was more on the fact that we wanted something that was brandable, especially towards the audience who we were catering towards, something that every sort of auntie and uncle could pronounce. Right, guava is an easy fruit to remember, and something that the domain name was available. And so those are all considerations when you kind of really think about, practically speaking, how you come up with a company name.
How did you guys kind of like, you were on this Skype call, Justin, Jeff, you're pitching ideas, Justin, you're like, no, I don't want to do any of those ideas. And then like, what was the point where you're like, okay, here it is?
So I don't think Justin was completely sold on day one. So I kind of gave him sort of the story of, back when I was in Santa Monica, the reason why I knew about this whole fitness world was because, being in Santa Monica, which is like the fittest part of the entire US, I was just immersed in this world where everyone was eating kale salads and going to Lululemon to buy their yoga pants. And so right across the store, right across the office where we were in 2nd Street in Santa Monica was a SoulCycle, which was the most popular fitness studio in America at that time. And so I tried it out for the first time. It was completely sponsored by our company, and we had like weekly classes. And I was just blown away by like the energy, how it was just so different from any kind of like environment. It was so bespoke. Everyone knew everybody from the first name basis, and I knew there was something there in terms of sort of that aspirational sort of fitness world. And so when I came out to Singapore, I saw the same trends that was happening with the first set of boutique studios that were becoming very popular. All of a sudden, spinning was a thing. There was all of a sudden mixed martial arts, Pilates, and all these different concepts. And so we just felt like it was the right time to really get something off the ground back in 2015. And I think with Justin, I think he believed in sort of the overall concept, but I think he was still sort of on the fence in terms of whether he was ready to take the plunge. And so my co-founder was like, you know what? We're just going to make sure he comes and joins GuavaPass. So he flew out to Hong Kong, literally just to close Justin. The second he landed, and then eventually I came out as well to kind of meet up with them.
Justin, tell your side of that.
It's not really different. I think for the audience's sake, just to be absolutely clear, I was not a co-founder of GuavaPass. I was the first engineer. but very very close to the ground floor. And yeah, it was Jeff and I had multiple conversations over different ideas. It might have been two or three, and then eventually Guava settled, and I was slated to help build the first system. And then while we were building the first system, this was all coming together about me officially joining the team. And so I continued to slow play it. I think is the way to look at it. And eventually, I was like, yeah, these guys continue to beat expectations. Jeff and Rob continue to do that for myself. And so at some point I was like, yeah, let's sign it, figure it out.
Wait, Justin, you were in Hong Kong at that time? You were living in Hong
Yes.
Kong at that time. And Jeff, you were in Hong Kong at that time? Or you were in Singapore?
No, I was in Singapore.
Okay, and then Rob was where?
Rob was in Singapore as well.
Okay, so you and Rob were in Singapore, and you guys like.
So we were like, how do we convince Justin to move from Hong Kong to Singapore was basically our number one priority.
And so you just got on a plane to go to Hong Kong, and you're like, okay, we gotta get this
Yeah.
done, basically.
That's the top priority. So we got to do what we got to do.
That's awesome. I don't know if I've gotten on a plane to close someone before, but I feel like that's something that all entrepreneurs should probably do at some point.
You do what it takes, I guess.
That's awesome. Do what it takes, right? Okay, switching gears like a little bit. I mean, we're gonna like jump past like a huge story, which is like all of the like time at GuavaPass, that kind of stuff. I mean, you guys learned a lot of stuff. I think GuavaPass, I think towards the end was like how many people? It was like it got quite big, right?
So we were live in 12 markets across Asia and the Middle East, just over 70 employees before we sold it to ClassPass when they came in 2018.
A little over 4.
Just close to 4 years.
Close to
4 years.
Yeah.
Okay.
Three years, 9 months to be.
I'm kind of switching gears a little bit because I think being a second time founder or repeat founder, like the second time around for me was significantly different from the first time, and it felt quite different. And I don't know if that was just me or if like other second time founders feel that way. And you guys are now second time founders. I guess maybe a good place to start is, does it feel different to you guys kind of doing it the second time around? Or when you guys I talked to you guys when you guys were getting started too. You guys kind of like hopped into it pretty quickly, right? It's not like you guys didn't take a year off or anything. It was like you kind of got right into it.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty much within the first few months after the full transition that we both kind of just got together and decided to, really get something off the ground. I think for me the difference is I felt like there was a lot more muscle memory that kind of kicked in this time around. So it's like when you're doing anything in life, right? When you take a swimming lesson or you learn how to ride a bike. Once you know how to do it once the first time, then even if you haven't done it for a long time, you kind of can pick it up. But I did feel very rusty in many sense as well, right? Because we were basically going back to the founding stages where you have to do everything on your own, and I was so used to already having sort of a full leadership team with a full functional organization that was able to do a lot of different things. And so being back at square one, where you're just building from scratch, was just a very humbling experience again, just to go through all the challenges and just dealing with the minutiae. It was just a reminder of just how crazy things were back 4 years ago. So I think that muscle memory definitely helps, but it's also, I think the challenge too is you kind of psych yourself out sometimes because as you pointed out earlier, you get older, you feel like you have more perspective, and I think sometimes that holds you back a little bit if you don't have that tunnel vision to just keep driving forward.
So actually digging into that part a little bit, I felt this quite strongly. I mean, I guess we're in the same in the sense that our first startups were acquired, right? And I think when that happens, lots of people kind of pat you on the back and think of you as like, oh, okay, like you're successful or whatever, right? And I think at least for me, starting the second one, there was a part of me that was like worried that I was going to kind of like pack it in a little bit or like take a little bit less risk, because now there were expectations. Like the first time around, nobody expected anything from me. And then out of the second time around, it seemed like people did kind of expect stuff from me. Did you guys feel that? Did that change any of your kind of like psyche at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, because especially with some of the relationships we built over the years, some of our investors, for example, in Gen Phi, were also former investors in Guava Pass. So they've already developed sort of that set of expectations that, we're investing in you guys as founders now, and it's no longer just about the idea, and it's because we believe you've been able to execute on it for the past few years, and so we're going to take another bet on you again. And so that's kind of creates a lot more pressure, right? Because it's you now have a longer term relationship that you don't want to let down, right? There's more at stake, and so that's why it's I agree with you. It's kind of hard sometimes from that perspective.
If you overlaid like your first 6 months at Guava Pass compared to your first 6 months at Gen Phi, do you feel like it was was different? Like, did you spend your time on different things, or the problem kind of set different? Like, how do you think about the first 6 months of both of those companies?
Yeah, it's completely different. I think with Guava Pass, we were not really thinking beyond more than 3 months at a time, to be honest, which is crazy. Like we literally, the first year only had enough capital to last three months. Yet we were hiring like crazy, not even thinking about the consequences, and just trying to build and grow sales without knowing what's going to happen in 3 months' time. And so I mean, that was absurd at the time, but it kind of worked out in our favor. I think with Gen Phi, we're a lot more methodical. We have a longer term sort of roadmap that we're following. Even though obviously with early stages it'll never be exact, but I think we have more perspective on where do we expect to be in 3 months time and 6 months time, and with that kind of mindset we sort of plan our resources accordingly. Maybe Justin, you have a different take on that, or
Yeah, I think so. One of the Guava Pass grew pretty rapidly. It was like 4 months, and it was like three markets minimum. Which, as an engineer, that's annoying because you have to deal with currencies and translations. And so the system and time zones, of course, everyone hates time zones, but the system outgrew my ability quite rapidly, and I had to get help within easily 6 months. Was probably by that point already too late. I needed it closer to 4 months in, but I stretched it out a little longer than I should have. With Gen Phi, of course, it's not a B2C. Being a B2B application, it affords you a few extra things. You don't have to develop a really nice mobile app. You don't have to do a few of these other things. And combined with the skill that I've gained over running the GuavaPass organization, the connections there, I'm able to run this engineering organization a lot leaner for a lot longer of a period of time. And so in terms of the number of people that we surround ourselves with, it's actually very thin in comparison to how we did it at Pass. I mean, as Jeff mentioned, we were hiring hand over fist, and today, we're a year plus in, and there's four of us, five of us, four or five of us, and so we've got a lot of support in other areas, but I think the feeling is quite different. But going back to that muscle memory, it's what you're supposed to do a lot better. There's a lot less question about. There's a lot less cognitive load about what matters versus what doesn't matter. Because that's probably the most important question you have to ask yourself as a founder is, what is the most important thing I need to be doing right now, today, tomorrow, the week? Is it talking to an investor? Is it building this feature? Is it chasing this customer, mitigating this thing? A lot of times you fool yourself as an early founder with a bunch of busy work and thinking that you're getting a lot done, but you're not. You need to drop. You can't catch everything. And you're like, oh, the font needs to be this perfect, or the colors need to do this, and the flow needs to do exactly. A lot of times you just need to deliver it and ship it out. You can't say that for every startup, but the vast majority of startups need to be able to just ship stuff and then iterate on it, right? The whole iterative point. But I think today for Jeff and I, we don't necessarily worry ourselves. I don't worry about Jeff and what he's doing. He doesn't worry about what I'm doing, because we know how to ask ourselves. We've seen each other ask those questions about what is the most important thing to do. Okay, I need to build a server. Okay, cool. I just go build a server. I don't think about how long it's going to cost. I know what's important to do, and that it'll pay dividends of this. Or I need to drop the ball, and Jeff's like, case in point, it's really important that we have our addresses correct, but man, I've been really slow on some of those tiny requests because I have all these other things that build up. And I just explained to Jeff, like, okay, these are the things that I'm working on. And then we're just like, cool, go. And that trust that you built up over the 4 years, it pays out dividends, and we're able to move at speeds that it would have taken twice, three times the number of people to be able to move this day, same time in Guavapass's age. So these are the benefits. The double-edged sword is maybe we're trying to do too much on our own.
I don't know. It reminds me of I have a thesis on the biggest difference between first-time and second-time founders. I wonder if you guys agree with this now that you're on the second one. I find, and Justin, I think you're alluding to it. First-time founders, at least for us, you don't know how to prioritize. You don't really know what's important, right? And so everything kind of looks important, right? Like, we got to get the terms of service down and all these legal documents. And should we be like, I mean, in the US, it was like, should we be like a C Corp or an LLC? Like, like all you think all these stuff is important. And I mean, like Jeff, you laugh because it's probably like those things are so not important, right? Like none of that stuff kind of matters in the early days. And I think when it's your first one, you don't know what's important. Everything looks important, and so you run yourself ragged, like just trying to do a good job on everything, right? And so I think first time founders, oftentimes, maybe it's good that you do it when you're young because you kind of need the energy because you just don't know how to prioritize. So you just run around, right? And I think the second time around, you know what's important, and so you allocate the time kind of appropriately. And you're like, okay, there's 100 things we need to do. Only these 10 things matter. I'm only going to work on these 10 things, and like that's the biggest difference. I also found. Are you guys more calm the second time around? Like just with the startup. Like I feel like our first one, I was like, I just was like running around and stressed out about everything. And then I think the second time I was like, okay, yeah, I kind of know how this goes.
Yeah, I think that's a function of two things. One is obviously the second time around because we've seen some terrible things before in the past, like in terms of like just like how challenging things can be and the fires
Yeah,
that we had to deal with. That
yeah,
anything less than that, we're like, okay, this is nothing. This is
yeah.
just a small fire, easy to manage. So
It's
we're definitely a
fine.
lot more calm in that sense,
Yeah,
a lot less frantic. And I think just our personalities. I think this time around, Justin's actually pretty mellow in many sense. So having someone that's more mellow than I am allows for a lot
yeah.
more of a calm and composed sort of reaction to situations. Whereas, with my first startup, I had a very high energy partner who was quite reactive, in a positive way, but it definitely made the panic level much higher back in the day.
It's also tougher too because if you guys are hiring and you're kind of like when you raise a lot of money and hire fast and all of that stuff, it's your margin for error. I feel like is smaller, right? And so you kind of need to get these things right, and so it it lends itself to kind of higher risk, kind of higher stress kind of stuff. Whereas I feel like from talking to you guys about Gen Phi, there. I mean, it's not like you guys are trying to make errors or anything like that, but there's a little bit more kind of room, right? Like you're growing, you're leaner, you don't burn as much.
I would say this: the stress level remains the same. It's just as fucking high. Can I swear? Is that okay?
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
just
yeah, yeah,
as fucking
yeah.
high as it always is. That never goes away. The shit that you deal with remains the same. It's just your ability. You you choose. The first time it was a mistake. The second time it's a pattern. I chose this stress level, so I now have to be comfortable with it. And so you learn coping mechanisms in the first step. You learn a lot of ways of dealing with that stress, and the stress hits you differently. Your reaction to it is very different than the first time around. At some point, you either say this is for me or it's not. But if you decided it's not for you, you're not going to start the second one. I'll tell you that.
So are you kind of saying it's like the first time around, and Jeff, you were alluding to this too. The first time around, you don't have that many data points. So when stress
Mhm.
comes, you don't know, right? You're like, I don't know, everything seems terrible. And the second time around, when you guys are starting Gen Phi, you're like, I kind of know how terrible things can kind of get, and I'm kind of ending back up, right? So I'm like, before I was naive and I got myself
Yeah,
into this, so I needed to get myself out of it. And then the second time around, it's like I know exactly what I'm getting myself into, and
exactly.
I'm
So
making
it's
this
basically
choice.
eyes wide
So
open this
I,
time.
I got to kind of like live with it. Do you
See the
guys,
punch coming. Oh my
do you
god.
guys feel like, I mean, there's some stuff you can do from on a company level, right? Like, okay, maybe don't get yourself to the point where you're like constantly kind of like 1 month away from not making payroll and that kind of stuff. Do you feel like there's stuff personally you guys have done, like develop to kind of like help your guys's kind of like, I don't know, personal well-being or like mental kind of well-being to like make yourself more resilient through this whole process?
I think it starts from just the very beginning when we chose and aligned ourselves on this business idea. I think one of the things that we always talk about, us all being sort of YC alums, is sort of this concept of default alive, default dead, and that basically means just creating a company that is either self-sustaining, that can kind of just keep going forever, or a company that keeps relying on external help. And I think the difference this time around is with GuavaPass. It's a direct to consumer company, and so the customer acquisition is always going to be very expensive in the beginning, and so you just need a lot of external capital to accelerate your growth, and you never know what's going to happen on the other end of the journey. I think with GenFi this time around, we were a lot more methodical about making sure that the business model was sound enough. Lending by itself is obviously a very tried and true type of approach, but making sure that we can build self-sustaining organization that can last decades, right? So that's the sort of philosophy that we both Justin and I shared this time around, is making sure that it's a default alive type of company. And so I think that focus, or that philosophy has made us, in many ways, more mentally prepared and more calm in terms of just understanding the situation that's for us. And so I think we're a lot more comfortable now with dealing with the challenges, and especially with the cash runway and planning ahead and understanding kind of what we need to do before we would ever reach sort of that point. Justin, you want to take this one? This is one of your favorite questions.
Oh yeah, sure. So do you, like, if you stopped all your marketing efforts and your sales efforts, are you and you no longer get a VC capital injection today, are you still alive? Or how long are you alive for? Are you alive forever, or are you alive for like 3 months because that's how much cash is left at the bank? And default debt is you're burning, general downward trajectory of your available cash. You need a capital injection to be able to make it to the next, whatever it is, year, 6 months. Yeah.
So, by the way, this is for all the audience. This is a famous Paul Graham essay, which I think is entitled "Default Dead" or something like that. So, if you want to like read the whole essay,
Yeah. Paul Graham. Yeah. Yeah.
I actually always thought of it as different than the way that you encapsulated, Justin. I mean, I could totally be wrong. I haven't read it in a long time. The way that I used to talk about it, and I talk about it with some of the companies in our program, is it based on your current trajectory. So if you just keep doing what you're doing, are you going to eventually kind of like be alive or be dead? And so they can keep the marketing and all that stuff going, right? But if you keep doing what you're doing, right? So you're just turning the wheel, you're grinding it, are you going to are you on the trajectory where you're going to eventually be dead without raising more capital, or are you kind of alive, right? And obviously if your current trajectory means that you're going to be dead, you obviously need to do something different, right? Like, you see the wall coming and you're just like running into the wall. And if that's the case, then we need to have a conversation around what those things are. But I don't know, I always thought about it in that way.
No, you're right. You're right. I think one of the famous ones is what happens if you never raise another dollar again, and it's kind of encapsulated. You're absolutely right about that.
I guess that's the litmus test, right? Is like if you never raise another dollar, which means, I mean, you almost have to be profitable in order to be default alive then, right?
Yeah, because break even's not enough, man. You're just one road bump away from into the ground.
There's not that many companies that can do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, in startups, it's hard to get to profitability, and I feel like every time you approach profitability, then there's some investors who are like, "Hey, be less profitable and grow faster," right? Like, take more of your margin and put it back into the business. So it's like this elusive target that you're like constantly kind of like getting close to and then dropping down. But I think the framework of how to think about it is useful to companies. Was there one more part about the repeat founder? Like, did you guys have like a list of things just even in your head? You're like, okay, second company, I want to do it differently than like the first company. We've been kind of talking around this, but was it like a conscious decision you guys were thinking about? Or was it like, okay, we started the second one and all the muscle memory kind of kicked in?
Yeah, I don't think there's a discrete list that we jotted down, but I think mentally part of the approach this time around is just making sure that we are prioritizing the right things that actually move the needle. I think when we kind of look back at our learnings with GuavaPass, there were some moments when we were chasing certain ideas and committing a lot of engineering resources towards, for example, for over a year, to something that shouldn't have been chased at that point in time because we were just still too early stage to be chasing so many ideas. And so I think that's something that we've learned to appreciate over the years, is just being hyper focused on the key thing that actually moves the needle and that works for the business, and really focusing on developing dominance and expertise around that before expanding horizontally to all these different sort of products and ideas that we want to build, because there's an infinite list of things that we want to do, but there's only a finite amount of time that we can use to deal with that.
And shifting gears a little bit, you guys have basically started two companies that are like having to do with SMEs. I mean, I'm using SME kind of like broadly, I think, but the Guava Pass is dealing primarily with offline SMEs, like, fitness studios and that kind of stuff. And now is it exclusively online SMEs for Gen Phi? I don't think is there a hard rule against offline?
It's not necessarily a hard rule. We actually do have a bunch of offline businesses, guys that are omni-channel, for example. I think the more of the the common factor among all these companies is the fact that they are looking for growth capital to really accelerate their sales. And where Gen Phi is built in the way to really fund the most productive activities of a business. And so that includes your marketing spend, like your digital advertising spend, your inventory purchases for e-commerce type companies, as well as growth initiatives, growth campaigns that a business might have for the upcoming quarter. So we like to think of ourselves as the most productive capital that's being injected into your company that then creates a strong positive ROI on performance. And so with that type of thesis, it actually does apply to all sorts of companies. Obviously, the traditional commerce and other online players really like our product, but we also do find a lot of offline players that are sort of in that growth mode as well that appreciate what we can offer for them.
So you actually do some offline businesses, right? What is it about SMEs and kind of this space that like pulled you back in? I mean, you guys could have done all kinds of stuff, right? But you still wanted to kind of work in this particular space. Was it something you learned from GuavaPass and you were like, oh, this is another part of the was this an idea that you guys had somewhere in the back of your heads during GuavaPass, or was it kind of completely different and you just knew a lot about this space? How did you guys come about?
Yeah, I mean, I think SMEs as a category is obviously very broad. I think we had a very, very focused subset of the SME market, which is the boutique studios back at GuavaPass. So I don't think it's representative of sort of the full spectrum of companies out there. But I think the one thing in common that, I guess we could share is that the mentality and sort of the attitudes of business owners it's just so different from like a typical employee. And I think that's what I've always come to really appreciate is that all of these guys that are business owners themselves are just hustlers. They are able to come tackle all sorts of crazy challenges. They're willing to put all the stakes in the ground and sacrifice everything they have just to make it work. And I think it's that sort of mindset and sort of that attitude that has allowed a lot of these business owners to be successful. And I think that's something that's very different from your typical corporate employee. And that's something that I've always wanted to be a part of this ecosystem where we could build something that could help accelerate and improve the performance for all these different business owners and really give them a chance to be more successful in what they're doing. And that's how we came up with Gen Phi last year.
People have been asking, they ask me sometimes kind of like about the ecosystem here in Southeast Asia. And I think one of the things that I often say is that people in Southeast Asia are very entrepreneurial. Maybe the like tech startup version of the entrepreneurship is kind of like coming up, but like as a whole, like very entrepreneurial, right? There's all kinds of businesses get started here, and like generations of kind of entrepreneurs are throughout Southeast Asia. So I think we're still, and I think we'd all agree, we're kind of like hoping that the startup version of entrepreneurship kind of like continues to develop here. But actually, there's like so much entrepreneurship like in the region, right? And I think you guys probably interact with the bulk of what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them are really under the radar. I mean, it's not like the U.S. where you kind of know the full spectrum of startups because there's such a developed, mature ecosystem. I think in Singapore and Southeast Asia, aside from sort of the small handful of sort of accelerators and sort of early stage investment programs, a lot of them just kind of just get started on their own, right? Using their own capital or their own friends and family. So they don't really get much publicity, and you have no idea where they came from. And all of a sudden, one day, they just become like a sizable business.
What? And so, I mean, just a little bit, I think, for the audience for how Gen Phi works, right? So a business will come in and apply for a loan. Actually, I mean, you guys should explain it. You guys actually work on it.
Yeah, so basically providing growth capital as a service. So a company would come apply through our online Gen Phi platform, and we would then connect to their data sources, right? So they would have, for example, their payment processors connected to us, like their Braintree or Stripe accounts, their marketing accounts, like their Facebook and Google, their accounting software, like their Xero and so forth. So everything's sort of one click, thanks to Justin. And then everything gets streamlined, and our underwriting engine is then able to make a quick assessment on how efficient are these companies with their productive activities. And then we can then provide them with credit line, or essentially a fixed amount of dollars to use to drive that growth. And what's interesting about our product is it comes with a virtual wallet called the Gen Phi wallet, which they then get their funds in the form of this e-wallet, which then comes with a Gen Phi MasterCard that they can use immediately to spend. So it's a very quick process, which could turn around within like one or 2 days max.
So I basically made you kind of say that so that I could set up this next question, which is which I don't know if you guys can talk about, but is there any businesses that have been really weird that have applied? Like you saw the application and you're like Jeff, come look at this, or like Justin, come look at this. Like I had no idea that there was a business that like does this. You guys, was there anything that was just like super surprising?
Yeah, I mean, we have random companies from all industries applying. I mean, we had one that does this very bizarre type of gold coin. It's a collector's coin, but it's actually been going gangbusters because it's actually real gold, and so people are actually buying it for just for the value as an investment of gold. But it's actually like a collector's coin, and their order.
And they make the coin.
They work with, yeah, I think they work with a bunch of different gold refineries to actually make the coin, and then they handle the direct to consumer sales. So all of their sales are via their Shopify and their Stripe sort of payment processors. But it's just bizarre. It's a very bizarre product that kind of just has crazy amount of businesses here.
I mean, it's bizarre, but I grew up watching those
Infomercials,
like
yeah.
Oh
Bible,
yes.
television commercials. So it's not that weird to me, but I was just like, oh, I forgot about that for like 15 years. That just because I don't see
Yeah.
those advertisements on YouTube. So
Wait, and it sounds like I mean, obviously don't disclose numbers and stuff, but it sounds like they're doing well. So was it one of these things where you're like looking at the application, you're like, this is a weird thing, and then you like see how well the business is doing, you're like, oh, it's actually like this is like a really big business.
Yeah, I mean that's the reason why we're agnostic to the industry in terms of who's applying. It's more about the underwriting itself and the metrics that come with it. And so at the end of the day, we're trying to back companies that are on sort of that growth trajectory. And so regardless of how they are able to generate their top line, if they can demonstrate that they are spending X amount of dollars in marketing and they drive this much growth, it's still a very fundable type business.
Do you have kind of like, I mean, let me know if you can share or you can't share, like benchmarks on kind of like what you're kind of like looking for in some of those businesses?
Yeah, I mean, so generally we have, just from over the, tens of thousands of applications we've received, we have a little bit of a proprietary engine now that can kind of sort of capture where a company should be relative to its industry peers. So if we know, for example, this company is this type of e-commerce player, right? It's a shoe retailer, for example. We know approximately what the metric should already look like for a company in that industry. So then we can kind of benchmark our data against the peer group. And those are actually really interesting data points that down the road we want to be able to then provide value to our future clients in the form of, maybe giving them recommendations and giving them sort of an assessment of how they're performing against their peer group.
Oh, that's really interesting because I mean, you guys uniquely have that information, right? I don't think that information kind of sits, I mean, outside of maybe like Facebook.
We have a lot of proprietary, like even like their Facebook spend and their Google spend. There's no other lender. Like, when was the last time a bank asked you for your Facebook account access, right? I mean, we have data that no one else has access to, and I think, hopefully one day we can create something useful where we can actually help provide like a recommendation engine or like analytical tools to help these businesses improve on their own activity.
You guys are kind of excited about the business, right? Anytime you have that level of sensitive information kind of aggregated together, you're going to be in a very powerful place. How do you guys think about? I've been thinking about this more, and especially I think in Southeast Asia, is that there's just a lot of like, I mean, Shopify is the biggest kind of push on this, but there's just a lot of, I feel like there's an e-commerce kind of stack being built, and it's like, okay, you build your website on Shopify, you integrate with Stripe for payments and so on and so forth, right? And now you guys are like help with growth capital, and so there's all these companies popping up to basically help people start businesses, especially online and D2C, and some of the entrepreneurship that we've talked about. But are you guys seeing anything maybe kind of like 5 years or 10 years out, or any parts of the stack that you think are like you're gonna, we don't see a lot of this yet, but you think is gonna kind of come down the road? There's Yeah, because it's like websites are Shopify, payments is kind of done. You guys are doing some like investment, kind of like credit, basically, right?
that's a hard one. So the reason why I say that's hard is because all the trends were bucked in the past 8 months. The F&B can't operate, and like the whole sectors can't operate. And what does that look like 6 months from now, a year from now, when the systems come back online, and where does that go? I think for us, the trends that keep this whole region super exciting is that you remove COVID in general, and it's just we don't know where it's going to go, but it's going to grow. That's what we know, and that's why we're so excited about this whole region is because every major country is was accelerating pre-COVID, and they're just waiting for that cap to be removed. And that cap will eventually be removed. So we're exactly where we're gonna be. We ask ourselves that question all the time, but the main thing is that we want to be along for that particular ride. I mean, that's why it is here too, right?
I think, as Sukan pointed out earlier, I think long term the cost of starting a business gets lower and lower with the full stack, right? So eventually it gets to the point where everything is a little bit more turnkey, where you can, overnight start a business. And I think that would actually increase the entrepreneurial population in the region. I think right now, when you kind of look at the education system and kind of the people that are sort of graduating, their mentality is still, oh, let me try to get a job at this bank or work at this consulting firm, and they're not really considering the interesting opportunity of just starting your own thing. And I think as it becomes easier and easier to do so, um, it encourages these individuals to want to take that risk and to try it out, because there's a roadmap in terms of, once you have this full stack, you can basically turn on something and you can test an idea very quickly.
And maybe that's the theme, right? It's accessibility. It's just making it so that more and more people can kind of like take advantage of all these things, and that stack gets built. Okay, last question. What was each of yours first paying job?
Okay, mine's not too interesting because I've never been employed until my first internship, which was working at a bank. I did Diners Club card marketing for in Hong Kong.
Wait, marketing? Like, what do you mean? What did you do?
Credit card marketing. So we were doing the campaigns to affluent cardholders, credit card promotions, and all those different initiatives to drive credit card usage across the Diner Club's card merchants.
So, but you were like in the marketing. You were like in the marketing
Yeah,
team. You were like in an office.
I was in the
working on
marketing team.
team.
I was a white collar worker in the marketing team. The only sort of manual labor job that I ever had was before that was basically when my parents would pay me to clean their car or like shovel snow back when we were in the U.S. But that's pretty much the extent of my paid manual labor that I've done.
Justin?
That's my first job was a Starbucks barista. Yeah, in Bellevue. I enjoyed it. I don't think management enjoyed me. I enjoyed it because I was always part of the night crew. I couldn't make drinks to save my life, but I was really good at talking to the customers. And any of my regulars who I liked, I'd be like, "Free drink, free drink." Yeah, no, yeah. Hey, John, how you doing? Oh man, it's good to see you, dude. Yeah, have fun on the house.
Wait, Justin, why couldn't you make drinks? Isn't it like being an engineer where you just kind of have to follow the
No. It absolutely is not like being an engineer. It is. I am not very good at highly repetitive tasks that need to be
precise, right?
Highly repetitive tasks. Yeah, that need to be very precise. And man, people like their Starbucks precise. They would never let me part of the morning crew except for cashiering.
Wait, isn't Starbucks like? I mean, when you probably worked a long time ago, but I feel like it's kind of like they have machines that would just like do it perfect every time, right? Like you need to just put in the right settings and like hit the button. Like, was that the case when you were working there?
Yeah, and I still could screw that up. I could still screw that up. Oh my god, it's so good.
By the way, Justin, you have to talk to my brother about this. He also worked as a Starbucks barista in the Portland airport, and he worked the early morning shift. So he was the barista at Starbucks when the Asia flights would land at like 3 a.m. and 4 a.m. He was the guy.
He was good then because they don't let you. You gotta be.
He said it was the grumpiest group of people he'd like ever seen in his life, like every day, because it's like you just got off the overnight flight. You need your coffee. Like there's a huge wave of people. Like it was terrible.
And man, you gotta talk to Suhan is the first thing you do.
Yep, you got to talk to Suhan. You should ask him about it. I think that's it. I appreciate you guys kind of being on and taking an hour to talk about your experiences.
No, man, it was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having us.